Hi guys, welcome to character drawing tutorial line, shape, and form. This is going to be the first in a 3-part video series where I go through the basics of character drawing. And this video series is actually like an edited down version of my class from Class 101. For those of you who are unaware, I made a class with Class 101 called Drawing Characters in Motion, Anatomy, Appeal, Posing, and More. I made this 3 or 4 years ago in 2020, 2021. And so I've asked Class 101 if I could have the class back to share and promote on my own. So they have agreed, and here we are. What I have done is I have chosen my personal favorite videos. So my favorite videos that I think cover like the absolute basics that are taught in the way I want to teach them are the ones that I've highlighted. So this class overall has 8 chapters, starting with extremely basic stuff and going into drawing fundamentals and figure drawing fundamentals, and then posing fundamentals, and then character design fundamentals. So this video is going to be about line, shapes, and forms. So this is foundations for solid drawing. The next video, which I'll post next week, is going to be about posing. I'm skipping anatomy because anatomy is something that you can learn anywhere, I think. And the things I'm going to share with you on YouTube are the things that I have not really seen other people teach on the internet that much. So if you are actually interested in getting this full class, you can. I have put it on PayHip for $30 for the entire class, and you will get this PDF, which has every video linked to Google Drive. This page might go down, I don't know, I've never used PayHip before, but I will link it in the description if you are interested in checking it out. But personally, I think the videos I'm gonna post for free are probably the most relevant and the ones that I'm proudest of. You know, it's been like 3 or 4 years. I was afraid to like watch these videos again because I was like, oh my god, this is like, I had never taught before, I'd never spoken to a microphone before, and this is my first time ever doing so. And I was like, it might be very awkward, and yeah, my voice is very different. I talk in a somewhat different way, but the content is essentially the same as what I still teach when I work with students and mentees. So I hope you enjoy, and I hope that these videos are helpful. Yes, let's get to it. Line, shape, and form. Alright, so welcome to the official start of the Drawing Fundamentals chapter. The next 3 videos, including this one, are gonna go line, shape, and form. So basically, we're gonna add 1 dimension each video. So this video is about draftsmanship in line, and I guess we should start off by defining what draftsmanship actually is. So draftsmanship refers to like your ability to draw. Usually you're gonna see good draftsmen as technical artists, like architects, or designers, or traditional figure artists. And I don't see that many people talking about draftsmanship when it refers to digital art or stylized art like anime or cartoons or anything like that. But what that basically means is that if you are a digital artist with good draftsmanship, it means you're gonna massively stand out from the rest of the crowd, because this is not something that most digital artists know to train. I once heard someone say that good painters are always good draftsmen first, and that kind of changed my entire perspective on art. Basically, drawing is the fundamental that supports all other fundamentals. If you want to rush ahead and do full color illustrations and pretty things, but you have a really poor understanding of how drawing even works in the first place, I think you're probably gonna struggle. And so working on your drawing skill, like just pure drawing skill, is super important. Line describes shape and form. So the logical way to understand this, for example, is if you draw a square, you would draw a square 1 line per side. This is logical. You put 1 line per side and you draw a square. It's not logical to draw a square like this, right? This doesn't make sense. If you could draw a square with 1 line per side, why would you use like 10 lines per side? And this principle applies to basically everything that you could think to draw. For example, if we made this into a cube, if you drew a cube, you would draw 1 line per side to describe all the planes. That is the most logical way to do it. And so if you decide to draw a cube like this, it doesn't make much sense. It's inefficient. So let's take this principle and apply it to some old artworks that I did before, and you can begin to see my development in draftsmanship. Because like I said, draftsmanship is something that will come with time and a lot of drawing. So we start out around when I was in middle school or high school, when I first started digital art. This is what my drawings look like. And so you can see, like, I was using a lot of little lines to describe one shape or one form. The thing I want you to remember is that simplify your lines. You need to simplify your lines. If you can use one line, don't use 10. Lines that you put down should always have a function, whether that be describing form or describing a shape. I think I was carving out a lot of my shapes and forms and using lots of little lines here. A much simpler way to have done this is the brow bone here is one line, the bridge of the nose is one line, and the ball of the nose is one line. The nostril is one line or shape here, and the nose here is one line. And same with the jaw here. You can see I use a lot of wobbly, indecisive lines here. But remember that lines describe shape and form. If your line is not describing a shape or a form, then it's a useless line, and you need to figure out a way to get rid of it or simplify it. And so what I could have done here, instead of using so many wobbly lines, is just use 2 lines. And you're going to see this pattern repeat over and over in all my old art, because this is something I didn't understand. So for example, this one, for his neck, I could have just used 1 line here and 1 line here. Or 2, just depends on how you want to describe that form. Another example of a full figure here. As you can see, there are like a ton of searching lines where I didn't know where to place them or how to use them to describe any sort of form or shape. You would get rid of these lines here and simplify using 1 line. And this might sound suspiciously like line art. Like some of you might be asking, like, but what if I like to do a messy sketch first and then do line art afterwards, and then line art follows this sort of formula where it describes shape and form? Yes, messy sketches are fine and good. But if your sketch doesn't describe any sort of shape or form, then it's kind of a bad sketch. A sketch is a sort of communication tool. It communicates to whoever's looking at it the shape and form of a subject using lines. It's okay if those lines are messy, but those lines need to communicate. If they're not communicating, if they're useless, if they're wandering, then it's no good. Okay, here I'm starting to get it a lot more. I started to do a lot of dance studies, and doing a lot of iterative studies is going to help a lot because it's going to force you to simplify the body or whatever subject that you're studying into like a formula of lines that you can start to reuse over and over again. I started to understand that to describe the form of the thigh, I would put something here and here and use little lines like this to describe the form of the thigh and how it connects to the leg. And to actually draw the thigh, I would use 1 line here, 1 line here, 1 line here, 1 line here. And you can see this pattern in the rest of the figures too. The point is to find a formula for how you're going to simplify a subject. The following year, I started to draw a lot more in pen. This is why I want you guys to draw in pen and to draw with a brush that is unforgiving, because pen is going to make you make decisions. It's not forgiving, and it's going to make you learn a lot faster. And so here, as you can see, it is sketchy. I did use a lot of rough lines, but all of these lines are defining something. For example, all of these lines here, they define the form of her chest. And all of these lines here define the form of her arm. Okay, so that was kind of the main point I wanted to go through in this video, is that every line you put down should define a shape or a form. And if it doesn't, then that line is kind of useless. And good draftsmen don't draw useless lines. So once you understand this principle, you can start to analyze artists who have good draftsmanship and understand how they're using line to describe shape and form, because every artist is going to do it a different way. And in order to learn this principle, you should study an artist who does this in the way that you want to do it. So I'm pulling up Loish here because she has more of a sketchy style that doesn't purely go line by line like I've been showing you. It's not necessarily like line art. A good way to study this is by watching people draw. like if you can find a video of an artist drawing, then you can start to understand how they see the world, how they're starting to simplify shapes and stuff. So when it comes to Loish, her art is very sketchy. She is using a pencil, which I told you not to do, but it's because she knows how to use that pencil. So the way she uses line to describe shape and form is that she uses a lot of wispy lines, but they all follow a flow and describe the form of whatever she's drawing. And she uses a lot of cross-hatching in order to communicate like the form of a subject. These are all cross-hatching marks. As you can see, she doesn't really waste any lines. There's no lines here that are confusing or don't communicate anything. Another example is Aruseli, which I showed in the very beginning. This is a clip from her Twitch stream that I captured. And what I wanted to show here was like when you're watching her draw, it kind of just looks like she's straight drawing line art, which a lot of good draftsmen kind of look like they do because they've drawn this subject so many times that they simplified it into a line formula. And that line formula is like very reliable, and the more you've drawn that subject using that formula, the quicker you can draw. So for example, if you look at how she drew that face there, she already knows one line for the brow bone, one line for the cheek, one line for the chin, that's it. And she's going to reuse that formula over and over again. Like here, on this face, she also used it. Brow bone, cheek, chin, jaw. And usually good draftsmen draw kind of slow because they're considering each line and their placement, because each line is going to describe and communicate a lot of things, and so they do tend to draw a lot slower than usual. And when I say they draw slow, I don't necessarily mean that when they put down a line that it's slow, like when they put down this line it's slow. No, when I say they draw slow, what I mean is that they take a lot of time between lines to consider the next one. So for example, if you're drawing 2 lines here, what are you thinking right here in between these 2 lines? This is where they consider a lot. If you think about drawing like music, and each line that you put down is a note, then the space you take between lines is the breath or the rests. So those rests and breaths are just as important as the notes that you play. So when you're drawing, try to slow down, consider the lines that you put down, and just take your time. Here's another section I wanted to show, and because she's erasing and redrawing a lot, and I wanted to say that like it's not that good draftsmen don't mess up or change their mind, it's just that when they do decide to put down a line, they know exactly where it's going and what it's saying. So even though they're going to erase and redo, whatever line that they do end up putting down is going to be a useful line. So by now you're probably wondering, okay, I understand the principle. How do I practice this? And the answer is going to be just about the same for everything you could ever think to ask. And that is to find an artist who does this in the way that you already want to do it because they figured it out, and then you steal their techniques, okay? And so here I have Aruseli's website. The way I studied draftsmanship is that I found something of hers, which I thought was like super amazing, which happened to be this environment right here. If you think her digital draftsmanship is good, then her traditional draftsmanship is even crazier. And so I looked at this and was like, it would be amazing if I could draw like this. And what I did was I just started drawing. I started to study how she did this. So here's an example of what I did. You see this shape here? I saw this mushroom and was like, I'm gonna figure out how she did that. And I just did it over and over and over again until I felt like I had some semblance of understanding of how she did that. And when you're doing these studies, really try to analyze and implement a feedback loop. Don't just copy. If you just copy, you're not learning anything, aside from maybe training your motor skills. So for example, I studied this rock up here quite a lot because I was so fascinated with how she did cross-hatching. And so I tried to copy it here. I really tried to understand how she was using her lines to describe this form. Don't just like randomly throw lines down just because you see someone else doing it. You have to understand it. And so here I made a note to myself. You have got to make decisions about form, because I tried to apply what I learned here to a new rock that I made, and I was just like flailing because I was kind of just messing around and not really understanding what she was doing here. So for your assignment, what I want you to do is find an artist who draws in a way that you really like, who describes form in a way that you really want to learn. And hopefully it's an artist who doesn't really do line art, or you find a sketch that they did. Try to find sketches, and I want you to study and analyze their work. So for example, here I have another picture of Arus because I just like how Aru draws. I think she's a really good draftsman. And what you do is you just start copying. If you're doing this digitally, you have an easier time because you can just draw on top of their stuff and really break it down. For example, if I wanted to break down this leg, I could see that she uses one line here, one line here, one line here, and so on and so forth. Go slowly, really try to pay attention to what they're doing and how their lines are working. I would recommend that you try to draw it on the side multiple times. If you're doing this traditionally with a pen, you're probably going to have an easier time just because you're not allowed to undo, and so you have to own your mistakes and learn from them. So that is going to be your assignment. Just start breaking down works of artists, redrawing them over and over and over again, make notes to yourself, implement some sort of like feedback loop so that you know when you've made a mistake and what you need to do next to fix that mistake. Make notes about how the artist you're studying uses line to indicate shape and form. Study more than one artist if there's more than one artist who has a draftsmanship style that you really like. And what I want to see from you from this assignment is not something perfect or clean or beautiful. I want to see what you're thinking. I want to see your research, your notes, your iterative practice. And lastly, just remember that this is something to just keep in mind for the rest of your artistic journey, because draftsmanship and like motor skills just take a lot of time and experience. But if you know what to look for and what kind of style that you like, then your life is going to be a lot easier. I look forward to seeing your assignments, and I'll see you in the next video, which is about shapes. The last video was about lines. This one is all about shapes. The goal of this video is to get you to stop thinking so literally. When you're drawing a character, you are not drawing a person. You're drawing the shape of a person. When you're drawing a hand, you're not drawing a hand. You're drawing the shape of a hand. When we're drawing, what we're really doing is taking reality, reducing the noise, and simplifying a complex 3D subject into 2D shapes. So as always, let's take a look at some artists who do a really good job of illustrating this concept. One artist that does a really good job is Nicola here. When he draws characters, you can see he doesn't draw like a person. He's drawing shapes. These are not people fighting. These are shapes fighting. This is not technically how like a leg and a foot would look. It's instead a shape that supports what he's trying to convey here. He's given us enough information to understand that this is the silhouette of somebody throwing someone else down. And you know, this is someone getting thrown to the ground. But this shape is so abstract. If you took it out of context, you would have no idea what it is. And I mean, just look at this. These are all just shapes of things. He's drawn an arm here and a hand, but he did not literally draw an arm or a hand. This is like a pentagon here and another pentagon for the hand. Another artist who's really good at this is Epsi. So I just found some images off of her Twitter, and we're going to break these down in shapes. This is an illustration she did of Magnus from the Adventure Zone. Really love her Magnus interpretation. So when Epsi draws, well, this dude is completely encapsulated in one shape. His entire body kind of fits between these points. That's the basic shape of his body. And within that, we can start to cut out the negative shapes. And if we erase these, this is the basic silhouette of his pose. Now that we have the basic shape down, we can start to divide that into even more shapes. And what you'll notice is that these shapes flow right into each other. all we're doing is dividing up these shapes into more shapes, but it's starting to really come together. And you see how when Epsi draws a character, all of her shapes stack really neatly into each other. Like, for example, you could say that this is one shape, and that this is another shape. She has really resolved shapes. There's nothing that is out of place. Everything belongs within each other, which is why this drawing feels so solid. Qming is another good example of this subject. Thinking in shapes is good for poses where things are not so literal. For example, when things are like overlapping quite a lot or are in motion, things that we don't usually see that often. No one's really checking to see if you got every wrinkle right in the pants or if you got every finger in the correct position in the hand. As long as you get the overall shape of these subjects, you're good to go. So for example, for Qming, she uses a lot of rectangular shapes, like just a lot of quadrilaterals. Most of these drawings are just built on stacked quads. For example, like this is a whole quad right here. And this is another quad. You could break this down here. Another quad. Another quad. Here's another quad. Basically everything she is drawing has an underlying shape language in it. A lot of animation artists use wedges and quads. As long as you learn how to draw these shapes, you can basically draw whatever. And even with the fabric here, like, I would think that flowing fabric is a very complex subject matter, but when you reduce it to shapes, it becomes very understandable. And as always, these artists make this look super effortless, but it's because they have been studying, they have been developing this shape language for so long that we look at this and think, of course that's how you would interpret this. So let's take what we learned and apply it to some photographs of real life subjects. So if you see this guy, how would you draw him? Would you get distracted by all of these wrinkles in his shirt? Would you get distracted by his hair, maybe? Would you get distracted by trying to figure out exactly how this hand folds into his pocket? Well, don't get distracted by all that. Focus on the shapes. So what shape is his head? What is the most rudimentary shape we could break his head into? Sounds kind of morbid, but it's kind of like a wedge shape. Alright, so this is his basic shape. We could reduce it even more if we wanted to. Do this. And this. But let's just leave it like that and start to fill in some detail shapes. And once again, when we start drawing this, we probably shouldn't get super distracted by, drawing the sunglasses, drawing her lips. Instead, we should look at her overall shape. If we divide it into even more shapes. And pay attention to how these shapes stack into each other. For example, the shape of the torso carries over to this edge. The shape of the pant leg carries over to the edge over here and connects along the edge of the torso. And the torso could also flow right along this back leg here and also connect with these arms. And notice how the edge of the jeans follows the edge of the foot, which leads to the foot shape. But that shape is interrupted here to make a triangle to indicate where the edge of that shoe is. Alright, so here's your assignment. It's basically exactly what I demoed during this class today. Number 1, identify an artist who you want to study. Break down one or more of their artworks into basic shapes. Number 2, break down a photo of a person into basic shapes. And if you want to make it more challenging, do some taken from a really weird or crazy perspective. Number 3, find an old art piece of yours that has really poor shape language and revamp it using what we learned today. And just a note about picking artists to study specifically for the subject of shapes. You should really try to train your eye to understand what artists are good at what things. For example, animation artists are usually really good at shape. So when you're picking an artist to study, try to look for someone who has a very good shape language. For example, here it's very clear what you could learn from this person. And for example, here I have some inspiration saved from Brittany Myers and Shi Yoon, who both work in animation, and you can see that their work is very shape heavy. You could very easily break these characters into shapes. They're very consciously designed with shapes in mind. Even these more realistic portraits from the Spider-Verse, you can really break these down into shapes as well. Try not to choose an artist whose work is more illustrative or complex, because it's just going to make your life harder. For example, here I have some inspiration saved from Yoneyama Mai, whose work I love. But if you're going to try to break something like this down into really basic shapes, it's just a little bit too complex to do so, even though the principles are applying here. Because her style isn't super shape heavy. She's very line heavy instead of shape heavy. So when you're doing this, pick an artist who you really like, who has a good shape language. Don't make it super complicated for yourself, okay? Take notes, break it down. I want to see you thinking. Next video is going to be about forms. Well, I'll see you there. Form is probably one of the most important fundamentals that you could learn. The purpose of learning forms is that so you have choices. Is that so you're not limited to whatever reference you're using, to whatever understanding you have of the subject already. So let's expand on this a bit. What makes a form a form? The cube is kind of like the universal basic form that everyone's gonna learn, so what makes a cube a form? A cube is a form because you can rotate it at any angle and look at it from any perspective. So the marker of a form is that it's understandable from every angle, and it's an object that we know how to rotate in space. This is the #1 most basic requirement for something to become a form. So things that are not forms, for example, are shapes. So if I draw this triangular shape, it's not a form yet because we don't understand what it looks like if we try to rotate this thing. But it could easily become a form in one of many ways. For example, the first way is we could use wrapping lines and make it a form. Once we start to define a shape with wrapping lines, it becomes a form. And a form is something that we can understand from all angles. So I don't really consider this a form until we start to rotate it and exploring what it looks like from different angles. So this is the one prerequisite I have for something to be defined as a form. If you draw something that you don't understand what it looks like from a different angle, for example, if you picture yourself as a director and you walk to the right and you have no idea what that subject that you're drawing looks like, then you haven't defined the form. And I think it's important to make this distinction and this priority because a lot of times when people learn form, it can get really tight and really mathematical really quickly. Or you start going the route of like a still life and you're just sitting there from one point of view drawing this reference or this subject from one perspective. And sure, you're shading and you're like drawing your contour lines, but you don't really understand something in space until you start to rotate it, until you start to bring that camera around that space. I did a little setup in my room just with objects I had laying around. Here I have some product placement, a Mob Psycho calendar by my friend Helen Peanut, her URL is right there, and Witch Hat Atelier, which is a manga that you really should read. Okay, now that that's done, if you did a study of this, for example, if this was like a still life that you were doing in class or a study that you were doing on your own from a photograph, I have the hunch that most people would just go straight for like, you know, getting really invested in matching every angle here. Like, oh, did I get this angle correct? Or, oh, did I get this correct? Gotta measure everything and like place every line perfectly, but they don't really understand what's happening here. You need to start picturing, what angle did I take this photo from? I took this photo from slightly above and at the right corner of this box. What if I placed the camera over here and it was looking this way? What if I placed the camera down here and we were looking at it from the bottom? What if we place the camera up here and we look at it from the corner of this calendar here? I like to think of it as your brain is a 3D modeling software like Maya or Blender or something like that, and your hand is a rendering engine. And so you look at this reference and you turn this in space. That's one step. That's the 3D modeling part of your brain. But then your hand has to be able to draw what you see in your brain. That's step 2. That's the rendering process. And so that's what we're going to go over in this video today. I fully believe that every person has it in them to understand and learn how to do this. It's not that complicated. You just have to start thinking about art in a different way than you're used to. And so what we're going to do is we're going to break down this photo into basic forms. The main one's probably going to be this basket here. And in CSP, if you hold down Shift, you can draw straight lines, which is very useful. And here the idea is to draw through the forms. Like, even though the basket is being blocked by this cup and these books and this calendar and these candles, you still have to be able to picture what the full volume and form of this basket looks like behind and underneath all of these other objects. And additionally, seeing through the objects and understanding what it looks like on the other side and the bottom too. So when you're doing this, just look for guidelines. Like, this edge here is going to be kind of parallel to this edge, but since we're at a perspective, it's like kind of not super parallel. It's going to eventually converge somewhere over here, so they're kind of angled like this, but not super extreme. So we can just kind of estimate that it's going to be like this. And same with all the other edges. Okay, so that's the basket. So yeah, when you're drawing through forms, just pay attention to the edges that we can see. For example, we can see this edge. We know that this vertical edge is going like this. And so we know that this one back here is going to be kind of similar. Since it is at a perspective, it's going to eventually converge down here. So they're not totally parallel, but they're parallel enough that we know that it's going to be very similar. And here, this edge is a little bit tricky because it's blocked by so many things, but we can kind of look at this one and kind of infer that this edge is going to be kind of like this. Okay, and with this cup, it's a cylinder, so the top is a circle, or an ellipse in this case. It's going to extend down, and the bottom is another ellipse. And we know that because we've all seen a mug before. But a lot of times when you're drawing forms like this is something my painting teacher gave me a lot of trouble for. Because whenever I drew like circular forms like this, I would draw it kind of like this. Like, the top would be circular, it'd be an ellipse. But the bottom, I would draw like a very straight line. And that wouldn't make much sense because the bottom is also a circle. So you have to like picture what the bottom of that form is going to look like. It's not just going to be straight or an eye shape like that. You have to draw through your forms. Okay, now that that's done and taken care of, we've simplified this photo into basic forms. So that's step 1. We've learned how to draw through forms. If we train our mind to think through forms like this, then we become a lot more free. And what that means is that we now know what this thing looks like from every angle. So now what we can do, for example, is figure out what this whole scene looks like from back here, like behind the scene. And if you're new to drawing forms or understanding space in a 2D way, it might be kind of difficult at first, but the more you do it, the more familiar you're going to become, and this is one of the most valuable things you could learn for yourself. So let's get started. Let's place the camera maybe at an upper angle over here behind the calendar at the corner of this box here. So kind of like this. And we're doing this, I think we want to kind of pinpoint an object that's going to be closest to the camera, or like a landmark that we could latch onto. So for example, for me right now, this is going to be like the corner of this box here. What we're really going to do is like just walk around this scene. A quick tip, if you want to make your boxes and your forms look more natural in perspective, then you can make your lines start to converge. For example, all of the vertical lines are starting to converge down here at the bottom somewhere, and so they're not parallel. The more lines you start to converge, the more natural your forms are going to look. For example, if you had a cube like this is an orthographic perspective, which means there's no vanishing points, and this is not something we would see in real life. This has no real perspective put on it. All of the lines are parallel. But in real life, and with like a phone camera lens, all of these lines would start to converge. This edge is closer to us, so it's going to be bigger than this edge. It's probably not going to be the other way around. For example, it's not going to be like this. This is a box that is out of perspective. This is massively out of perspective. Not that it's a form that can't exist in real life, because it can. It's just going to be not a box and not rectangular at all. Okay, so we've placed the camera at this point, which corresponds to this point over here. So this candle is on the outer edge of this box over here. And we should probably map out what the bottoms of these objects are going to look like, so that they don't intrude on each other's space. And it's about here that we should probably straighten up our verticals and find out like exactly what kind of perspective we're implementing here. We're not using any sort of grids, but we should still follow a general rule. So for example, all the verticals, everything that's straight up and down should follow this kind of guideline here. So this candle kind of needs some tweaking because this vertical is not following those rules we set up. And on this edge, we're probably going to see these books balanced against it. And behind all of this is going to be this stack of books, and these mugs. We're probably not really going to see them, so I'm not going to worry about drawing them. So yeah, we basically walked around this object or rotated this object, however you want to think about that. Okay, let's try another angle now. Let's say I want to put the camera on the floor looking up at the scene. And let's say I want the main subject to be the stack of books over here. So this is going to be the main thing that we see. We're going to see the front of these books. So we're probably going to be over here looking at the scene like this. Let's just go ahead and draw those books in first. Since we're looking up, they're going to be kind of at an angle like this. And to the right of them is going to be this stack of books, but they're kind of at an angle. So we're going to see this edge right here, and it's a little bit tricky to think about. And so we are like a little bit sunk into the floor, which isn't really possible. But since this is art, we can do whatever we want. And see here, I made the mistake of making these vertical lines go this way when these are going clearly outwards. So they need to all converge into the same place. So these need to go like this. Probably gonna see a little bit of this mug over here. Once again, this vertical's at this angle, not at this sort of angle. Next, we should tackle this basket. It's gonna be a little tricky, but If we follow our rules, we'll eventually figure it out. And there's quite a bit of space over here between the bottom of the book and the basket here. So we should probably make that happen. Here I just fixed the books because I realized that this edge here and this edge here are parallel, and I had not placed these books farther back enough to make that happen. And you see how this edge here is parallel, so I need to illustrate that. And you see, I think I made a mistake because this edge here and this edge, these are not parallel, as you can see here. They're at an angle to each other, so I need to fix that. Okay, this is starting to look more accurate now, and we should probably take care of this calendar. This calendar is going to be sitting on this edge here, kind of like this. It's kind of leaning over the edge. And the back is mostly straight, and the front is the part that is kind of angled. So the back is going to mostly follow these vertical lines here. The top is going to follow these lines here. And we're probably not going to see this candle at all. Let me just clean this up a bit. Okay, and it's not perfect, but we can basically get the idea. For example, these two lines are a little bit too parallel for me. It looks like these are converging over here somewhere. So we should probably change this edge to do the same. And we could converge these to make it a little bit better. So it's kind of all about converging lines. For example, all of the vertical lines follow this sort of pattern here. We didn't necessarily draw in any perspective grids, but we don't really need to. We can just kind of eyeball it and fix our angles. For example, this edge here is obviously kind of wrong because it doesn't follow this rule that we set up for ourselves. And the same thing applies to every edge that you're going to draw. For example, these lines here, they indicate that these lines are going to converge over here. So every line that's heading over there should follow that. Doesn't need to be perfect. It just can't be like super off about it. For example, this edge can't be going over here, you know? And note that the converging lines thing only applies to objects that are like facing the same way. For example, this stack of books here is going to have the same converging lines as the basket because they're basically placed right next to each other. Whereas this stack of books here is going to have a set of different converging lines because it's at a different angle. However, the vertical lines for all of these do tend to converge because everything here is mostly straight up and down. If we wanted to place something here that had the same converging lines as this stack of books, for example, if we drew like another stack of books here, then they would have to have the same converging lines as the stack. For example, these edges here would have to follow this. And if we place something over here, the verticals would have to follow these verticals over here. And anything heading this way would have to match this edge over here. And you can just keep on doing this for every angle that you can possibly imagine. So this is why you learn form, because it frees you up. You're no longer tied to this image that you took, or whatever image that you're looking at, or whatever figure you're studying. Once you know how form works and how construction works and how to see through objects, you can decide where you want to draw this thing from. And once you do decide on an angle, you know how to draw those forms so that they're believable and solid. So this example might not seem very scintillating. It's not very exciting, but once you start applying these principles to things like portraits, for example, if you wanted to draw something like this and this is your reference photo, you're no longer tied to only copying exactly what is here. You can move the camera wherever you want. You could put it under his skateboard, above his head. You have complete and total freedom to interpret and direct space and perception. And this is something very powerful. So if you can learn how to do this with very basic shapes first, and then eventually level up to drawing humans and figures, then your characters are going to have a lot more solidity, believability in life. And here's an example of me demonstrating how this principle works with character illustration. For example, I drew these avatar kids from a front-on angle, but we can easily break their figures down into 3D forms. And once you do that, you have choice. I could have turned the camera so that it was on Zuko's side, or I could have put the camera behind Katara's head and it's looking downwards at this scene here. So what this does is that if there's something you want to draw, you're not limited anymore. You can really choose how you want to portray that subject and what camera angle to use. So here's your assignment for this video. You're just going to do exactly what I showed you. The first step is to make a simple setup using objects you have laying around. You can make this as simple or as complex as you want. Just make sure to use objects that can easily be broken down into basic forms like books or jars or mugs, or, depending on how much you want to challenge yourself, be as minimal or as complex as you want. If you're new to this subject, I suggest just doing like 1 or 2 objects and starting from there. So you make a simple setup using objects you have, and then take a photo, break down the forms in the photo, draw through those forms. Step 3, draw the scene from at least 2 additional angles. And this is why I want you to make your own setup, is that so if you get stuck trying to picture what an angle looks like, you have a reference right there. You can just go back to your little setup and walk around it and see what you're missing and what you're not understanding. So yeah, this might be kind of challenging if you've never drawn forms before. That's why you're learning art in the first place, right? So no worries, just try your best and use your brain. I'll see you guys in the next chapter, which is about breaking down the human figure.